So keep that in mind as you're asking questions and as you're able to submit Q&A. We will try and go as far as we can in terms of answering the questions that we can answer to the best of our abilities. Also invited to the forum tonight was the Director of Safety, Murphy Robinson, and he also declined to attend tonight. Both of them referred back to their statement to OIM that was submitted yesterday in writing. And so any type of answers to your questions, we would have to direct back to their statements. So tonight's presentation for tonight's forum features the Denver Independent Monitor, which is Nick Mitchell, on his office's independent report regarding the police response to the 2020 George Floyd protest in Denver. From this point on, I'll give the floor to Nick Mitchell, and after him, we'll reconvene with questions. Nick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and attendees. I'm going to ask Matt, who's on the call, to share his screen. I understand he's not able to do that. Julia, are you able to rectify that?
Yeah, give me a second, or Matt, if you wanted to share the materials with me, I can make that work.
So while that kind of technical issue is being worked out, let me just say again, thanks to everyone for being here, for being engaged in these issues. I'll plan to run through a presentation that summarizes the report that we issued yesterday, talks at a relatively high level about the findings that we made, with the goal of leaving enough time in this meeting for Q&A and discussion between with the board and with others in the crowd. So I guess the first thing, while they're trying to work out this technical issue, let me say that let me just give a little bit of background. So we by the City Council in June to conduct an investigation into and review of the police response to the protests that occurred in our city from May 28th through mid-June. I don't think I need to provide a lot of context for the folks on this call. I think people are well aware of probably many of the reasons why people were engaged in protests. Of course, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota was a precipitating event, though certainly not the only event that drew people into our streets. How's that coming along with the slide deck?
Matt, go ahead and give that a try. Just change some settings. And if you can't make that work, there we go.
All right. Very good. Next slide, please. So, by way of context, again, the demonstrations were largely characterized by peaceful demonstrations, particularly during the day. They were extraordinarily large. We had as many as 10,000 people in our streets, and maybe more on certain days. At night, there were often eruptions of violence and violent clashes in the streets between attendees and police officers. There was significant property damage created, both to private property as well as government buildings. And the demonstrations that happened in our city were unique in a number of important ways. First, historically, protest in Denver has often been sort of directional. There's been a point A and a point B. There's been a march that began in a certain location and ended in another, with sort of organized speeches and other events at the second location. And while there certainly was organization in the protest, and there certainly were speeches, the protests were sort of multi-directional. They occupied a lot of space downtown. There were groups that moved in different directions throughout the downtown area. As it became sort of clear in our review and in this investigation, that had a significant impact on the response of the Denver Police Department to the demonstrations. Next slide. We focused our review on the first 5 protest days. While we would have liked perhaps to do a review of the police response to the entirety of the protests, given the resources available to us and the fact that we have a number of other projects ongoing, as well as a full docket of investigations, I made the decision that we would focus on the first 5 days, given that was when most of the police use of force and much of the sort of, many of the clashes between police and community occurred. And during those 5 days, the police department made 339 arrests, mostly for curfew violations, though also for other charges. We looked at metrics concerning the protests in general. We obtained data from the fire department and other sources. The fire department responded to more than 200 calls related to fires during the protests, and there were 39 guns seized from the streets during that period. There also were significant injuries to both protesters and police officers. So there were 81 officer injuries reported by the police department. 11 officers were placed on limited duty, and 4 took time off for injuries that they sustained while engaged in police work during the protests. Next slide, please. There were also many serious community member injuries, although it was impossible for us to know the precise number. We requested and obtained data from Denver Health related to calls from the paramedic division, which made 125, responded to 125 calls during the first, I don't think that was for the first 5 days, but that may have been.
Am I really? Thank you.
9 or 10 days of the protests. Of course, we're sort of well aware that many community member injuries were not.
I'll try not to pick my nose then. Thanks for letting me know.
Of injuries is likely far higher than 125. There were many complaints and concerns raised about police conduct during the protests. Some of them were complaints of a sort of general nature. Others were specific, particularized allegations of misconduct, excessive force, and the like that were made to the OIM. Some may have been made to the COB. I know that some were made to the City Council. Of those, the Internal Affairs Bureau opened over 100 investigations. Some of those have been closed already, as I'll discuss later in the presentation. More than 50 investigations remain open to this day, and they're being conducted by Internal Affairs with oversight from my team. There was also, as I mentioned, significant damage to government property and private businesses, as we set forth in the report. And as we look to sort of map the impacts of the protests, another metric we used was the litigation that has resulted. 3 lawsuits have been filed so far, and more than 50 notices of claim have been served upon the city. So as I mentioned in my presentation this morning to the Denver City Council, there is a wave of litigation coming related to these protests.
That's an understatement.
Particularly regarding police conduct during the protests. Next slide.
Who's going to pay for that? Us.
So to do this investigation, we were under I won't call it a mandate, but we were asked by council to do it quickly, to do it thoroughly. And we tried to do that. And I suppose that I should say, in the course of our work, we made, numerous requests for, documents and video and other information of the police department. It was, my impression that the department shared information with us freely and, provided interviews of personnel at ranks throughout the department, as well as, again, documentary evidence and footage. We also received significant information and cooperation from community members. And I want to thank and recognize the community as well as the police department for sharing information with us. We reviewed police policies, procedures, reports, rosters, inventories to the extent they were available. I won't sort of go through each sort of item of evidence here. Hundreds of hours of body-worn camera footage, halo footage from the police Air One helicopter, and all of the police radio communications. So all of the communications that went over the police radio channel used by officers during the protest, or at least during the first 5 days. We also interviewed dozens of officers and command staff, other Denver employees, and as I mentioned, community members, and reviewed, considerable amounts of, academic research and best practice literature and national standards on the policing of large crowd control events. Next slide, please. So, among the most controversial subjects concerning the police response was use of force by the police department. Sort of overall approaches by the DPD to crowd control, as well as sort of individual allegations and concerns about specific uses of force. And so one of the first things we do in the report is discuss the particular weapons and munitions that were used by—
Sorry, I heard all this morning. It's
we
the
walked
same.
through in detail the particulars of those weapons, their technical specifications, the sort of manufacturer warnings about when they can, should, and should not be used. And the tools that were used most often were pepper ball launchers, and both
Using
sort of
breathing app
active
right now, trying to bring down my heart
rounds,
rate.
rounds of pepper balls with
It's called Pokemon Go.
pepper powder, as well as
Beating the
inert
shit out of a
rounds,
Kurim.
were used by the police department. So rounds that have
More
were filled with powder that was not active and did not have a chemical agent inside. 40 millimeter
Straight Ari, I'll
launchers,
get on it.
we have pictures of all of these, by the way, in the report. Were used OC foggers, gas and smoke grenades, rubber ball grenades, and flashbangs or noise flash diversionary devices. Next slide, please. I think one of our most important findings or sets of findings in the report relates to what we have called the internal controls on force that were used by the police department. It is a fact that police agencies tend to struggle in large crowd control events. It's a fact that we've seen borne out in many cities during the George Floyd protests. We've seen it many times before. And so, one of the mechanisms that police departments use to try to, regulate the amounts of force that are used by, or the amounts of force being used by police officers, is developing internal systems that kind of measure force and, again, sort of regulate.
Yeah, we don't even have systems that know where our police are at any given moment. They have to go through payroll to do that.
The police department, their management tools, and they're particularly important in crowd control events. So we look to measure the extent to which the DPD was engaged in the use of those internal controls, and we look in the report at the tracking of less lethal munitions, so to whom they were being deployed or provided in the field, and when they were being deployed by officers, the creation of officer rosters, utilizing or requiring body-worn camera to record uses of force, the prompt preparation of use of force reports by officers, the issuing and recording of orders for crowd dispersal, and the requirement that only officers who've been certified can use particular types of high-risk, less lethal tools. And as we discussed in the report, we found significant gaps and deficiencies in the police department's use of each of these internal controls.
Pretty bad, y'all. It's pretty bad.
First, there was really no effective tracking system for the less lethal munitions being used by the police department. There was no log.
No.
There was no kind of computer.
They didn't even have an
system that
ineffective
measured,
one.
to whom they were being deployed in the field. There was no system that police managers or command staff could use to evaluate whether particular teams of officers were running through less lethal munitions at disproportionate rates. That is a sort of management tool that police leadership should be utilizing to sort of measure if there's a problem with the way that force is being used by particular officers or particular teams of officers. The fact that there was no effective tracking system also made it incredibly difficult for us to do.
Or ineffective tracking system. There's no tracking
so
system.
instead of,
Period.
because we couldn't really measure the volume of munitions deployed on each day, because that tracking system didn't exist, we looked at the DPD's acquisition of munitions. And so we obtained the purchase invoices and purchasing documents associated with each order of munitions placed by the police department during the first 5 days. And the DPD ordered more than $200,000 worth of less lethal munitions during that period.
Less lethal munitions. That's kind of like pedestrian-friendly corridors.
In terms of who they were being deployed to and the rate at which they were being expended. And so it was really impossible for us in doing this review to determine the quantity used by the police department. I've included a few graphics here at the bottom that are drawn from the report that show the volume that was in the DPD's inventory when the protest
Thanks for being here again.
And then how
Blakely.
That volume increased.
I know you're here this
based
morning.
on
You're the best.
Orders placed by the DPD during those first 5 days. Next slide.
Did not track how that 200,000 was
Another
used.
Significant gap was in the use.
I would love to have
of
$200,000 that no
so
one was watching
early
how I
on in
used
this
it.
Review,
It'd be fun.
we made a large.
What would you do with $200,000
request
if no one was
for
watching
documents
you?
from the police department. As I mentioned, we received quite a bit of information and had a very good working relationship with the department in providing us with information. However, we did request access to evidence.com, which is the online database,
And didn't get it.
in which body-worn camera footage is housed.
And didn't get it.
The DPD did not provide us with access to evidence.com, and instead,
No
on
training,
its own, identified
no certification, and no clue. We don't know where they are, and we don't know where they are with those munitions at any given moment.
So, over time, over
Good
a
one.
series of emails and communications, the department sent us links to download 1,280
That I needed that. I've had a horrifying day. Eleanor, that was amazing.
Of the protest. That was 226 hours of video. We reviewed it all many times. And we were looking for a number of things when we reviewed it. Of course,
I really wish I'd get paid to fuck around and fail. That'd be great.
Force themselves, trying to evaluate uses of force that we saw on video. We also wanted to.
I know, I
measure
stream
how
everywhere.
often were body cameras being
Just trying to make it as
activated,
accessible as possible because not everyone can use Zoom.
And that became incredibly challenging, given that many officers simply did not have their body cameras either attached to
Or on.
Because
they didn't fit on their turtle gear. Did you know that?
Did
you know that?
Riot gear or turtle suits, or if they didn't
Didn't
the
attach.
cameras were not being routinely activated. For the
Those cameras, they need new cameras that won't fit on their suits that they can forget to turn on.
For each of the first
And tasers. Where's the taser going to go?
Important management tool.
You could do with the taser. You can use a body camera.
Are assigned.
You can use a gun though.
Where they're assigned, what skills and certifications.
And a
they
pepper
have.
ball launcher.
It was not until the 5th protest day, June 1st, the DPD
On the
actually
5th day of
presented a roster.
protest, DPD
And so on
gave
that
to
day, according
me.
that roster, there were between 150 and 200 officers working the protest, but we received only footage from only 38 officers for that day. So there was a significant gap between the number of officers who are working and the amount
Someone
of
want to
footage
finish that
were
on the
provided.
5th day of protest?
We explore in the report
The
some of
police
the
gave
reasons
to
for that, some of the reasons we believe may have been responsible for that. Some of those reasons concern the ranks of some of those officers, so not all.
I mean, there's fuck around and find out, then there's fuck around and fail. I'm just going to leave that up there till anybody says anything better. I'm not sure anyone could.
Lieutenants, captains, commanders, and chiefs
Dare.
were not required to wear body-worn cameras. And they represented a portion of that footage.
You would think, but when you got $200,000 to burn,
to be sure. So that was another sort of breakdown in.
Why would you do that? Who needs oversight?
Protest days. Next slide. Another important system that the department can and should be using is tracking uses of force through the preparation of written use of force reports by officers. So it's sort of well settled and established in policing that when there is a use of force, that the officer who has used force must prepare a written report documenting what he or she saw, what the specific conduct was that caused the use of force, and other observations. It sort of allows us in my office to provide some scrutiny over each use of force. It allows the police department to track uses of force. It's an incredibly important management tool. And in fact, DPD policy generally requires officers to prepare those reports during their normal patrol duties. During the George Floyd protests, the DPD was not requiring officers to prepare those reports until a lawsuit was filed.
Too busy for paperwork. And I don't know if y'all been paying attention to city council, but reading's hard. That's why our council members are committed to not doing it. And don't try to hide it. This was a 94-page report, you guys. That's a lot of reading. And there's no audiobook, did you know? Thank God for the Cliff Notes here. This PowerPoint. You're the best, Nick Miller.
To create use of force statements, which we reviewed. The department produced to us over 400 use of force.
If you have ever been in a meeting and said, didn't do the prep, reading's hard, tell me about that. I'm very seriously, I'd love to know. I just went in a meeting and lambasted a whole bunch of people who 6 months after the Black Lives Matter movement started could look me in the face and say, well, I still don't get it. And maybe you should just stop bringing it up, MK. You're a problem. Problem's me, y'all.
Officers themselves expressed concern in some of those documents about being asked to go back in time.
Well, I didn't read it because I'm busy and important. Oh my God.
Or more beforehand. So that was another sort of breakdown that was problematic.
I don't need to be on camera, y'all. Fuck this day and fuck everybody on city council. Fuck the board of the nonprofit I'm on.
In the report is the inconsistent reporting.
Fuck everyone who doesn't understand what Black Lives Matter is. Fuck everyone who doesn't understand that the police abuse their power. Fuck anyone who doesn't think that the police needs accountability. And fuck and if you don't know what defund means, fuck you for not looking it up. Fuck you for not doing the basics of figuring out what that phrase means before you run away from it. Fuck you.
That chemical munitions are going to be deployed.
Fuck you for not including CS gas in your report, OIM.
Leave the area if they choose to do that, and warn them that if they don't leave the area, that they will be subject to force and potential arrest. Both best practices and DPD policy.
And if you're here and you don't understand that the reason that all of this is going to be referred right back to a private investigation by DPD, and that because of a city charter, legally that's what we have to do, that we have no option. And now you aren't fired up about changing the city charter, then fuck you too. Get where I am. This is going to keep happening.
To the extent they were issued,
all of this. Ineffective.
In audio, video, or in writing by the police department.
Yeah, fuck Obama. Fuck Obama for coming out and saying that he didn't, that we should never have said defund police. All right, maybe we needed better marketing, but you could have supported the notion, Obama.
Hours of body-worn camera footage and footage provided to us by community members. We saw
not Obama fan, sorry y'all. You got the wrong woman.
Police and dozens of situations in which chemical munitions in particular.
Y'all understand that like family detention started under Obama, right?
Crowds from particular locations, and in only a significant
that he and Biden expanded
interactions did we see dispersal
Never mind, I'm
orders
gonna
provided by the police department. And in some cases, when they were provided, they didn't really comply with the policy or the national standards. They did not include a sort of path, an exit path for folks. They often did not give repeated warnings. sort of a countdown, if you will, which they should when that's possible. It's not always possible, but when it is possible, when there's no unfolding emergency, a countdown should be provided. And so even when they were issued, they were deficient from our perspective and from our analysis. Another issue was officer identification. So the public has a right to
know who's shooting at them.
Identify officers who they've interacted with through, at the very least, a badge number. That's an important sort of accountability mechanism. Based on complaints that have been filed related to the George Floyd protests, as well as our review of video, it was our conclusion that identification was an issue during the protests. I mentioned the 50+ investigations that are currently ongoing related to misconduct complaints. We have already had to dismiss probably now close to several dozen complaints of misconduct, in large measure because we simply were unable to identify the officer who was alleged to have used inappropriate force. That is, the complainant didn't get that person's information on the scene. And given the documentary gaps I've already discussed, we were not able to find it either due to a lack of body worn video, missing rosters, and other information. So the officer identification and having it easily and clearly visible on the exterior of the riot gear was another issue that we identified and that we discuss in the report. Finally, with respect to this kind of group of findings, but certainly not last in terms of its importance, is the requirement that officers be trained and specially certified to use particular, potentially high-risk, less lethal tools. And we focus in the report on pepper ball launchers and 40mm launchers. And the Denver Police Department has a process in place whereby officers can be certified to use those tools. They have to go through a several-hour course to learn about how to use them safely and appropriately. They have to get certified, and I think they have to get some range time, if I'm not mistaken. And so we wanted to evaluate and measure the extent to which the officers who were using those devices during the protest actually had received those certifications. And we found at least 5 cases in which officers stated explicitly that they were not certified, but they were trained once they arrived at the protest. So they were given some kind of emergency field training on the street on those tools when they arrived. Others reported having used those tools, but when we looked at the DPD's internal records on certification, they were not on those certified officer lists, and so it appeared to us to be more than likely that they also, even though they didn't explicitly say that they were emergency field trained, we think it's likely that may have also happened for some of them as well. Next slide, please. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, there were 81 officer injuries, and we certainly viewed footage involving police officers being targeted by rocks or other thrown projectiles. And it's my understanding that there are criminal cases pending related to some of those incidents. We also viewed footage of police officers using less lethal weapons against protesters in ways that we found extremely troubling. We saw examples
because the union makes it impossible to fire anyone.
Spray or pepper ball at persons who were verbally objecting to police behavior and not engaged in any apparent physical resistance. We saw examples of pepper ball being directed at, or impacting prohibited areas of the body. The continued deployment of chemical munitions after people were already dispersing or leaving an area. We saw explosive devices thrown at or extremely close to people, sometimes resulting in them being knocked to the ground and suffering apparent injury. And we also saw OC spray being deployed towards the drivers of vehicles, or throwable munitions being thrown into lanes of traffic in ways that were seemed to us to be extremely dangerous and also, frankly, confusing from a tactical perspective.
I'll be right back, y'all.
We referred a number of videos, as we discussed in the report, to the chief of police for review. And
I just heard the cry of the children downstairs.
Next slide. We also evaluated the policy framework for the less lethal tools being used and made a number of findings and recommendations connected to that policy framework. Firstly, the DPD used a number of two principal high-risk explosive devices. That was rubber ball grenades and flashbangs, as I mentioned. Excuse me. Rubber ball grenades are generally, and I won't sort of go into all of the particulars, but they are grenades that are filled with rubber balls. I think the number in the particular devices used by the DPD is 180 rubber balls. And when the grenade is detonated, those rubber balls are propelled outwards from the grenade body in 360 degrees. And they can travel at a distance of up to 50 feet. And they're different from most of the munitions used by the police department, and that they really can't be targeted. So they cannot be, as I mentioned, the projectiles travel outward in 360 degrees. They cannot be targeted at a particular individual. So when they're used in a crowd control situation, they hit, to the extent that one person was to be targeted, they hit that person and everyone else in the vicinity. The body of a rubber ball grenade can itself become shrapnel, and research into the use of that tool raises significant concerns about the risks of eye damage, other soft tissue damage, and even in some extreme cases, potential lethality associated with their use. Flashbangs, people may be more familiar with, and I won't sort of go into the technical details associated with what they are, but both were used during the protest. We have records documenting the use of both, and we've seen video that reflect the use of both explosives during the protest by the DPD. Next slide, please. One of the and I suppose I should say before I move here is, I guess to close the loop on that prior point, DPD policy does not sufficiently articulate a standard for when those high-risk explosives can be used. There are tactical applications that SWAT may use them in, but there's really no sort of policy language that clearly sets forth the standard that the department will follow associated with when they can throw those explosive devices and when they can't. And so one of our recommendations in the report is that they need to articulate such a standard. And with respect to rubber ball grenades, in fact, they need to just disallow them for crowd control in general. They have, from our perspective, no place in the policing of crowd control events. They have no place in the policing of protests. They should be disallowed. And it's my understanding that the department has agreed with that recommendation and will, in fact, ban them for that purpose. Pepperball, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of, there was quite a bit of pepperball used by the police. The precise amount is impossible to determine at this point, but it was high. Pepperball has two principal uses. It can be used to saturate a particular area, so it can be fired at the ground near an individual or individuals, or near a wall or another hard object. And when it's used in that way, the pepperball round explodes, the pepper powder is dispersed, it causes irritation, and people will leave, at least that's the theory, that people will leave that area. But it can also be direct fired, so it can be fired at a person's body. And we saw many of both kinds of uses in the video that we reviewed from the protest. Each use presents different risks. So, area saturation exposes people to, the chemical irritant. But direct fire exposes people to the pain of impact, and actually it can cause damage. It can it can create bruising. If it hits someone's eye or other kind of unprotected soft tissue, it can actually sometimes create internal injury. And so the current Denver police policy, or the policy that was in effect at the time of the protest, did not distinguish between those two different applications. It lumped them all together. It permitted the use of pepper ball in the case of defensive resistance, which is as sort of low as blocking traffic. From our perspective, the policy needs to clearly articulate the difference between those two applications, and there needs to be a higher standard associated with hitting someone with a projectile that could potentially do them serious damage in extreme case. And so we've called on the department to create that distinction in policy and to raise the threshold for direct fire applications. And again, it's my understanding the department has agreed with that recommendation. Next slide. Another important group of recommendations relates to the mutual aid provided by other agencies who came into Denver. The Denver Police Department invited in a number of law enforcement agencies, and actually 18 responded during the protests. That's not uncommon, during crowd control events. It's a relatively common feature of crowd control when cities have major crowd control events. We see that happen with other police departments in the country. Those 18 agencies primarily sent tactical teams or SWAT teams into Denver with all of the weaponry and SWAT gear that SWAT teams generally have at their disposal. And so we wanted to evaluate that mutual aid was provided. What were the agreements that were in place between those agencies? How had they negotiated in advance what the standards would be for their operations in Denver? How had they negotiated command and control issues to make sure that all of those 18 kind of diverse police agencies were operating under the same rules? And what we found was that in fact those agreements simply did not exist. They had not been entered into. There were no mutual aid agreements between the DPD and its 18 law enforcement partners. We made a request for any relevant mutual aid agreements. The DPD provided us with 8. 6 were for agencies that weren't present during the protests, and 2 simply weren't relevant because they concerned matters other than crowd control mutual aid, and so they simply were not relevant to our analysis of the DPD's response to these protests. Next slide. We attempted to assess the kinds of policing done by those agencies in Denver. We did that by obtaining some after-action reports prepared by those agencies and looking at their use of force policies and other associated documents. It was our conclusion that some of those police departments were very active in Denver. They were conducting their own arrests. They were using force of various kinds. Other departments were slightly more passive in that they were asked to protect property or protect firefighters who were responding to fire calls or defend entry points to the interstate to keep protesters off the interstate. But in assessing the kinds of force used by those departments, it was quite clear that some agencies used less lethal weapons that simply are not approved for use by Denver police officers. So, and we go through this in some detail in the report. Some of the agencies used rubber ball rounds, they used less lethal shotguns, and they used beanbag rounds, all of which have been disapproved for use by the DPD. And so we had concerns about the use of tools by other police agencies on our streets that we have disallowed our own police department from using, or it has itself, I should say, disallowed for its own officers. And another issue that we identified is that those agencies all, of course, have their own use of force policies. So they have their own standards associated with when force can and cannot be used. that differ in important ways from the standard in the Denver Police Department's policy. So, and there was really no attempt to harmonize those standards. There was no attempt to come up with a shared approach to establishing a standard for when force could be used on our streets. Another important difference was that not all of the agencies required that officers intervene to prevent inappropriate force. That is a feature, or that was a feature, of the Denver Police Department's use of force policy. That was a feature that actually grew out of, in many ways, discussions with the community in the use of force policy task force of several years ago. And it's a key feature for modern police departments. Not every agency had it. Whether or not that had any impact on behavior on the street is simply a way to know. Next slide, please. And finally, we also referred a number of issues back to the police department for its own consideration. These were largely operational issues that we identified during our review. I've talked about the specific recommendations that we've made for specific changes, but these were areas that we thought the police department needs to engage in its own analysis and figure out how to fix the problem. We weren't going to prescribe what they should do. We just identified that there were issues that needed to be fixed. First is that in a lot of our interviews with police officers and sergeants, we heard repeatedly that officers didn't always know what they were supposed to be doing out there. They didn't have a clear sense of what their tactical objectives were, didn't always have a clear sense of when they should be using force and when they shouldn't, didn't always have a clear sense of when they should be advancing versus retreating from points of potential conflict with crowds. And given that we heard that over and over again, it was our view that the DPD needs to fix that. Generally in policing of protests, police departments follow an incident command structure. And one feature of incident command is that there is an incident commander who's appointed to set the overall goals and objectives of the protest response, and then an operations chief who's responsible for sort of tactics being used by officers. And it was our perception that there was
get a drink and be back
in that structure in the protest. Many of the supervisors who we talked to said they had no idea who the operations chief was. They weren't getting the kind of tactical or strategic guidance they needed from an on-the-ground field commander. We think that needs to be fixed by the police department for any future deployments. Another issue we heard repeatedly was that the single radio channel that was used by the department for all communications between officers was often overcrowded and inaccessible. So all police radio communications were consolidated onto a single channel. And the experience that was relayed to us by officers or actually generally sergeants is that when they would try to get on that channel to ask questions of the command post or to request resources, to talk about particular points of conflict, they would attempt to key up, but because there was only a single channel, they would be unable to get access to the airtime. And so they would end up having to make decisions sort of on their own without any kind of centralized, coordinated guidance, which was frustrating for the supervisors and may have had an impact on some of the problems that we saw developing on the streets of Denver. And another issue that we referred back to the police department relates to the frequency and the volume of crowd control and field force operations training. It is, it is key to give officers the training that they need to successfully police a large crowd control event. Some of that training relates to, formations and line formations, sort of technical details associated with the policing of an event like that. Some of it relates to de-escalation. So the training is very important. A lot of the officers we spoke spoke very positively of the training they received before the DNC in 2008 and have described a declining sort of volume of this kind of training in recent years, we reviewed records from the training academy and corroborated their observations. We corroborated that, in fact, there has been less of the training being provided, and we think that needs to change. The DPD needs to equip officers with the right tools for how to police, these kind of events successfully, and training is an important and a critical piece of that. So I guess I'll end there, and of course, if there are questions or comments, happy to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. That was, as you can imagine, that's all of that information, which is very concise, is only the first 5 days, which a lot of times when I read that report, I have to wrap my mind around. That was just the first 5 days, not even entire picture of the full time that this was going on. So there's a lot for us to unpack there. There are a number of questions that are out there, and I want to allow the community to ask the questions first. Many of you have already put questions in the Q&A here in the chat here, and Julia Richmond, board member Julia Richmond, has actually been monitoring the Q&A, and she will ask a couple of those for you from the Q&A. However, if you would like to ask your question personally, go ahead and put that in the Q&A that you have a question that you would like to ask.
Who got a question?
Without us reading it out, but you saying it yourself. Just keep in mind that in order to move back and forth, that takes
I'm
a little
yelling at
bit.
them, not you, baby. You're good.
We're doing the best we can. So be patient in that process, and I'm going to turn it over to Julia, and then after I've given the community an opportunity to express
Totally
those
still get
questions,
ice cream?
then,
Yeah.
the
You know
board
why? Because you're
will
not on city
ask them
council
a
and
few
you listen to
questions
me.
after that. Julia?
Thank you. And I'm just
City
gonna leave
council
these
and San
verbatim.
City Park gets ice cream, no one else.
So in some cases, Monitor Mitchell let us know if that's not an
So much beer, I need to get through the shit.
to answer, and maybe it should have been the public safety department or police force directly. But I'll just read them and you let us know. From an anonymous attendee, what is being done to hold the police criminally accountable for harms done to citizens? Even when they are guilty, they are treated as innocent. This was the whole point of protesting unequal justice between the police and the community.
Well said.
So, thank you for that. That is really a question.
Good job.
There's sort of one
Legally they
principal
can't.
Prosecutor for the city and county of Denver. That's the elected district attorney, Beth McCann. The city attorney has certain prosecutorial powers, but the primary prosecutor who has the ability to charge individuals, including members of law enforcement, is Beth McCann. So that may be a question that's most appropriate for her, given her scope of authority.
Yeah. From another anonymous attendee, earlier today during the city council meeting, OIM stated DPD doesn't have the radio channels to communicate. In my understanding, there are many channels, but only a few recorded. This literally closes the lines of communication. Being a survivor or DPD clerical errors and oversights, what is the next step to update this? What I believe is an analog system. Second, what is the point of external monitoring if the actions are returned to the IBA? Wouldn't it be better to turn this responsibility over to the FBI or an outside independent?
So there was a lot in there, but I'll do my best to respond to all of it. So if I said that during the city council meeting, I apologize. I may have misspoke. Okay, it's not that the DPD doesn't have additional radio channels. There are many radio channels available to the DPD. There was a management decision by the police command to consolidate all of the communication onto a single radio channel. So it's not a technical issue associated with availability. It was simply a management decision, and in the report, we're reflecting on some of the consequences of that management decision, which we think was problematic in a number of ways. In terms of the oversight of the complaint process, I hear the point. I understand the point. You know, that is the system that we have in Denver. That's the system that's enshrined in Denver law, you know, in the ordinance and the charter, that the OIM does not have the authority to do those investigations on its own, that we must refer them back to the Internal Affairs Bureau of the Police Department. It's a topic that comes up periodically in discussions with City Council and in discussions with the community, whether that is the structure that people believe in and want to continue, but that is the current structure. In terms of referring, you know, complaints of misconduct to the FBI, I think the FBI probably has no interest in, I can't speak for them, of course, but I imagine they probably are not interested in picking up that kind of municipal city level responsibility, and they may likely have no jurisdiction to handle that kind of work anyway. But I think there is, you know, this is an issue that comes up frequently, and it's, you know, it's worthy of further discussion by this board and by the City Council.
From Megan Ives, can you explain the process by which the complaints made about the police conduct to internal affairs are investigated and dealt with? Does the OIM have any authority to bring penalties / consequences for misconduct against Denver police? And how legitimate is this process?
Yeah, that probably is, you know, relates to the same point that was just raised. We do not have the power to do those investigations. We refer them. We have access to information from inside the Internal Affairs Bureau, so we can be present for interviews that are being conducted. We can recommend additional areas of inquiry, questions to be asked. We have the power, of recommendation. But I think our most important power is the power to create transparency and shine a light on what's happening in the internal affairs process. So we issue routine reports to, you know, this board and to the community about what we're seeing in the complaint process, and whether it's working or not, whether it's deficient or not, and we will do that work in connection with all the complaints concerning the George Floyd protests. We will at some point be providing feedback to the public through official reporting about, you know, the complaints that were filed, how they were triaged, how they were investigated, and whether or not, you know, there was appropriate accountability at the conclusion of the cases. That's the authority we have.
Also from Megan, why are the Denver police allowed to use chemical weapons of war against their own communities? Aren't many of these less lethal weapons banned in international warfare? Are the health consequences of these weapons well understood?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. You know, why are they allowed? I guess the law, because the law hasn't prohibited them from, you know, the law doesn't have a prohibition saying that they can't use them. If that feels like an area that's fruitful for discussion with City Council, that may be something you want to pursue, you know, discussions with the council about. Are the health consequences well understood? I think the answer is I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. I've heard and read reports of people expressing, you know, serious health consequences that are sort of not disclosed, associated with, you know, the use of CS gas. How good the research is into that, I'm not 100% sure, but it is a concern that I've heard in the community, and I think it's worthy of additional discussion with, you know, potentially with City Council representatives.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia.
Yep.
We'll bring it back to the board members at this time, and take a couple from the board members, if you have any questions, and then we'll move back to the community.
I have a question.
Nikki. Sure, Nikki.
This is for the Independent Monitor. Mr. Mitchell, in your report, you state that the DPD was able to arrange to have an airplane flown to Wyoming to procure additional munitions from the manufacturer, but nobody was able to procure the tools necessary to allow officers to attach their body-worn cameras to the
Woo!
gear?
Good question.
Is there an explanation?
Good
Not
question.
for me. I'm not. I can't really answer why. I think you're contrasting the, maybe Herculean efforts to get additional munitions with maybe what would seem like a reasonably easy fix, getting some Velcro to stick the cameras onto the protective gear. I don't really know the answer to that. That may be an appropriate question for the chief to be able to answer. So I don't have a good answer for that.
Thank you.
Karen, did you have a question? You're on mute. There you go.
Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned in the report that there was a decline in training for the rank and file around the use of munitions and I think probably crowd control. Are you aware of why there has been a decline in the amount of training?
So we interviewed staff from the training academy, as well as others, to get at that very question, Karen. What we heard was that there was a lot of pushback associated with the demands of normal patrol duties, that some of the supervisors in the police department, some of the commanders were concerned about the amount of time being eaten up by all of the training that's required. For police officers to remain certified, they need to go through a certain amount of training each year, as well as the training that's conducted on top of that. And so I think the answer is probably one of resources, and maybe this is a little bit of speculation, but it may be that training kind of got on the bottom of a long to-do list, at least training for these subjects. It's clear to me now that the DPD recognizes that it cannot allow that to happen again. It must prioritize that kind of training, but I think it was largely a question of resources and some supervisors in the department being kind of resistant to having officers out of their patrol duties for lengthy periods of time to receive that training.
Is there that type of training at the academy for the new recruits?
They do receive a small amount of field force operations training and crowd control training. It's not extensive. It is a small amount, and it needs to be refreshed and deepened through continued training throughout their careers. It's really not, from talking to officers, it's really not enough on its own to properly prepare them for an event like the George Floyd protests. It's just not deep or extensive enough.
Okay, thank you.
Nick, as part of your investigation, did you compare, if there's a way to do this, our response with other cities that are comparable population size and police department size? I'm just curious, and that question has come up a couple of times in terms of best practices, and I know it's kind of hard to define a best practice with something as spontaneous as what took place this past summer. But at any point, were you able to do that, or is that something that's possible, or is maybe that something to look at in the future?
It may be something to look at in the future. We took a look at what some other cities had done, and some of these issues were, I think, common to a number of cities that struggled with how to appropriately balance, the demands of the First Amendment to allow people to mobilize and express themselves with some of what was happening, during the protests. So it didn't go, in many ways, I think it didn't go that well in a number of cities in the United States. There hasn't been a lot of this kind of critical analysis that we've provided in this kind of report produced so far in other cities. Maybe that's coming. If it does, then maybe there'll be some other lessons that can be learned by our city from work that's done in other cities, but I don't think it's been prepared yet.
Absolutely. Thank you.
May I ask another question?
Sure.
Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned in the report that during the 2008 convention, the rank and file team that think that there was adequate training for that. Are you aware of who provided it?
Is Dr. Alexander sipping tea?
Particular event?
I think some of it was the DPD's own budget, and I think some of it, there were federal grants provided to cities at that time to help prepare for the DNC. At least that's my understanding. So I think there may have been a mix of local money from Denver's budget as well as federal money flooding in to help the city get into a position of readiness for that event.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I think we'll go back to take a couple of more questions from the community. Julia, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Great. A question from Katie Blakely. On Monday, City Council
Yes!
approved a new contract that includes access to evidence.com.
Yes, Katie Blakely.
Open free access to evidence.com.
That's my girl.
By OIM and COB for the duration of the new contract.
No.
Do you want to say anything more about that?
I don't think so. But I mean, I can.
You just shut him down, Katie Blakely. I'm so proud of you.
Yeah, they have not. We were not given access to evidence.com for the purposes of doing this review. And, you know, as I said, we were given the ability to download particular video files, and we have not gotten any commitment from the department to give the OIM access to evidence.com connected to that new contract or otherwise.
Question from Harvey Bowden. The gaps in the delivery of information and lack of transparency as stated in the presentation seems to answer my question. These inconsistencies seem to cover up pertinent info. Who can investigate the police in regards to this?
Who can investigate the police?
In terms of, I'm not sure if the question relates to evidence.com.
I appreciated your question. Love you, girl. So proud of you. Best protest kid ever.
The gaps in the delivery of information. So in terms of our review, we received a lot of information from the police department, and so I would not generally characterize it as not being transparent with us during this review. We did point out significant evidentiary gaps that the DPD simply information that wasn't being kept and should have been by the DPD. I think this is the investigation of that issue. I don't think there's any other investigation of that I'm aware of, unless the city council intends to do something with this report. But I think this is likely the investigation into that issue.
I think my question aligns with a couple others later down is just concern about you not being able to have access to evidence.com. And without that, and somebody kind of referenced cherry picking the videos that got sent to you.
That's right.
Causes some distrust.
That's right.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, it would have been better for us to have evidence.com and be able to look at, the audit trails and the back end of that database and see all of the footage with our own two eyes. That's obviously not the position that we were in. But we've heard that concern from a number of people, including a number of council members this morning. And so this may be an appropriate time to revisit that subject with the police department.
Baby!
A quick question. What is by charter or by statute, what is the police department required to share with you? I mean, is there
nothing?
Or are you purely at
they ain't required to do shit.
The kindness of their hearts as to what information you can receive from them?
Yeah, no, it's not kindness of their heart. It's laid out in the ordinance that empowers the OIM, and in fact, the ordinance was amended in 2015 when there were when my office experienced some problems with obtaining information from one of the departments, we went to City Council to obtain a stronger provision that established a presumption that the OIM would have access to the documents and personnel and information inside the police department and sheriff department. And that provision includes, I believe it includes databases. There is pretty strong language there already. Even though we've seen, at least in this case, we were not given access to evidence.com.
Okay, a couple of questions. Oh, go ahead, Terrence.
Because of the lack of access to evidence.com, should we ask the city council, or I don't want to put you in that position, but it seems like, we should get some clarity from the city council in terms of an ordinance, or maybe even executive direction from the mayor as to what, data is, how that's defined, so that evidence.com is included in the definition of what data is. That is pretty broad. So evidence.com probably should fit into data, but I'm just a simple country lawyer, so I'm not really sure.
You and me both. But I think a fair interpretation of the ordinance, as I have read it, is that we should have access to evidence.com. What the kind of appropriate steps for making that happen are, I'm interested in your thoughts about that, but I think the guidance is there.
Sounds like it's an enforcement issue versus the ability to enforce the statute that exists versus clarifying it.
Yeah, or I might frame it as compliance rather than enforcement. But yeah, I think that I think it is maybe a compliance issue.
You had a question.
Questions from Lucy Martin. Were there any instances of Denver police intervening to prevent inappropriate use of force against civilians? And then a follow-up question. I read in the Denverite that Councilwoman Kniech asked whether there was any investigation of targeting of journalists. I'm interested in that as well, and whether there was any investigation of targeting of medics or legal observers. There were several media reports of these targeted assaults on these groups. The last question in this grouping is, does the police department have any response to that, or have they committed to instructing officers not to attack people in these groups?
So regarding the first question, I don't know the answer to whether or not there were instances of DPD officers intervening to prevent the use of inappropriate force. We don't have any record that I'm aware of that occurring. It's not to say it didn't happen, but we don't have any documented record of that happening. In terms of an investigation into the targeting of journalists, as I mentioned during the council hearing this morning, we are involved in a number of investigations that concern those issues. And when those investigations are completed, I think that's something that we'll revisit. We did not find in our interviews or in any of the documents that there was a policy that directed officers to target journalists. Whether it happened, I don't know. We're looking into that in a number of cases. I guess the same answer may relate to medics or legal observers. We did not find any policy guidance that related to the targeting of those individuals. It's not to say that it may not have happened. That's an issue that I think has arisen in some of the investigations that remain ongoing. And does the Denver Police Department have any response? I know the chief has indicated that there's some First Amendment training that he has arranged for his officers. I think the board has had some dialogue with the chief about that training before. I don't know what the current status is on that, and when if it's been delivered or when the chief is planning to deliver that to the force.
Did you hear that? There's no policy that explicitly says you cannot target legal observers.
Able to not submit all footage requested by the independent monitor instead of cherry pick footage.
Kind of feels like that may relate to the evidence.com subject that we already discussed.
Okay. From Wes.
They were totally targeting medics. I know this.
The DPD did not agree with. The current chief style is generally to agree. And number two, is there going to be any follow-up in a year or two to see if the recommendations were actually implemented?
Amanda Sandoval did ask for that.
So it's my understanding.
I'll give her credit for that.
Agreed with all of the recommendations, has raised concerns about the feasibility of requiring all mutual aid partner officers to adhere to the DPD's use of force policy. But I don't think there's sort of an outright disagreement on that subject. And yes, absolutely, there will be follow-up. There must be follow-up. Make the report meaningful, to make sure that the recommendations are enacted and people can be kept safer in the event of future protests. There will be and must be follow-up to make sure that they actually get implemented.
I have a couple things, I guess, real quick, and that's probably the biggest things that jumped out to me in this report. Are, of course, the body-worn camera piece. And I understand that that's been brought up a couple of times, and the reasoning...
Just to be really clear, guys, they could get a helicopter to go to Wyoming and get more ammunition, but not Velcro to attach the body cams to their turtle gear.
The different suits that they were wearing for protective gear. That was a big
That's why we keep coming back to this.
It protects the officers, it protects the community. Ultimately, it really protects the city from any type of frivolous lawsuits or ones that are illegitimate or legitimate.
So many illegitimate lawsuits. So many illegitimate protester lawsuits against the DPD. Poor little DPD. God damn.
And I know that in the investigation, most of that was
I've had a bad day,
how
y'all.
it was used. We know that, hey, we don't know. They didn't track it, so we don't know exactly how many was used. Keep in mind, this is just the first 5 days. B, we have an issue with the uniform that we need to now find out how to attach these to uniforms. C, it was a dynamic situation and it was difficult to track. But I have to keep coming back to the question in terms of rationale for a lot of this. If we take all of this out and we go for rationale behind why it was used in the first place, or how we can determine the efficacy of using weapons like that. What was the willingness to discuss some of the rationale behind the use, and some of the rationale behind?
We don't know because they didn't document anything. We don't know. God damn it, we don't know.
And I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm just struggling to put my mind around that.
Join me.
Operational piece.
Yeah. You mean sort of philosophically?
Yeah, just philosophically. I'm just curious.
Let's get philosophical about the police.
Of course, I don't expect you to speak for the Denver Police Department.
Yeah, that feels like a good spot for the chief to be heard on. I mean, we've certainly heard a lot of explanations during interviews with officers and command staff. I think the narrative about the protests is very different depending on who you talk to. And we heard a lot from officers about violence in the crowds and attacks on police officers. I don't want to be in a position of kind of representing their viewpoint on what happened, but it feels like an appropriate conversation to have with the chief about philosophically why turn to these tools as opposed to other kind of crowd management tactics. I will note that there appeared to be a change in approach by the sort of end of the 5th day and into the 6th day, where we saw in our video the department sort of leaving more space investors in police. We saw sort of a kind of different
struggling, y'all.
approach
Struggling.
to some of the
Second time I've heard this today.
potential points
But
of
these are better questions.
conservation. And so I think
I'm
the
sorry.
department- there was some
I'm really
learning
sorry,
happening
Carol.
inside
If
the
you were here, I'd
department
fix it. I
at
got
that
2 more of
time,
these in the fridge, and I'm going to consume them tonight.
concerning its own
Probably straw in the
tactics
second
and
before the shit's
approaches
over.
that it would want it to use. But I think it'd be good to have some conversation with the
Since
chief
you're here, Dos
about
Luces,
this,
best
both
beer
for,
ever.
you
I
know,
love
the
Dos
board
Luces.
as well as for the community.
Thank you, Nick.
Is Dr. Beyonce, April Alexander going to speak some more? I love you, April.
Professor Lehman, have you disaggregated the data for police officers and community/victims by race, gender, etc.?
Of course not. They don't have that kind of data.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We have that data for the police department in general. We do not have rosters.
Of course not.
So we do not have complete records.
Couldn't
for
do that.
All of the police
Literally
officers
couldn't
who were
do that.
involved in policing the events. We don't have complete, use of force records.
We don't know which cops were out,
so
what
very
munitions
hard
they
to do that
had,
for
what they's
police
doings.
officers. We
God.
have some of that data for persons who filed complaints with our office. That is a piece of information.
Somebody invite me to a raid. I need a raid right now.
Form. I will say though that it's often not completed. It's often not filled out.
Damn it.
And so
Good, I got one.
I think our data for the community would be incomplete on that question as well. So that's not something we've looked at in particular. I think it is an interesting question, but I think the data would be incomplete both for officers and for the community.
For the record, Dr. April Alexander, Queen Beyonce here, has been screaming for this data since I've known her.
The OIM address body cam access or its findings to address officer abuse? If not, what supplemental department policy or legislative action do you recommend to make body cams use effective without the fiscal note that already exists?
Good question. I'm not sure if SB 2217 will help because a lot of the issues related to body cameras, addressed in the bill were already sort of incorporated into DPD policy. So I'm not sure that bill will have a significant impact on the Denver Police Department in the same ways that it may impact other law enforcement agencies in Colorado. Someone brought up the recent new contract regarding body-worn camera that was inked by the city council. I think they're very interesting.
Hey, I want you to know I changed my mind. I'm going to stay on that goddamn board and treat them the way I treat city council.
This is now, there have been multiple times which my office has issued reports about problems with body-worn camera activation. And I think some technical fixes will address some of that. The chief announced that body cams under the new contract will activate whenever an officer's weapon is withdrawn from the holster. I think that's a nice innovation. But in reality, weapons are not drawn or pointed that often by police officers. The vast majority of uses of force don't involve guns; they involve hands. And so, if the goal of making a technological change to body cameras is to make sure that uses of force get recorded, tying that to the—
Oh, she's sipping the tea again, y'all. Look at her go.
Really
Beyonce.
solution.
If you don't follow Dr. April, I understand you. Dr. April Alexander, you really need to. She is amazing.
For example, will
Absolutely
automatically
spectacular.
activate the body-worn camera anytime an officer stepped out of his or her patrol vehicle, whether the camera is linked to the car, and then it can be, it can be turned off if the officer is going into a private area or needs to use the restroom. But I think there are some interesting kind of technological changes that should be explored to fix these activation problems. Whether additional legislation is needed, I'm not sure. I think it's an interesting question. Maybe someone could do some research into other, legislation.
So Kate, to answer your question, yes, the body cam footage comes from SB 217 and from CORA, the Freedom of Information Act.
Julia, to bring in a question from our online community.
Theoretically.
A question that Twitter
As I
user
understand it.
William Paul Colgan posted. When we were discussing access to evidence.com, he said, why didn't the OIM contact the city attorney to force compliance? Mr. Mitchell, could you discuss the relationship between the safety department, the mayor's office?
Y'all get ready. You're going to love this. You're going to love it.
Who gives who legal advice, who decides what to enforce?
She works for the mayor, not for us. The city attorney doesn't work for us, y'all.
Every city agency, and the OIM is an agency of the city government, receives legal advice from the city attorney's office. So the DPD receives legal advice from the city attorney's office, and so do we. That is the kind of the structure that's in place. Frankly, I'm not sure if the city attorney knew about, the evidence.com issue. It was not something that, while the investigation was ongoing, and once we started getting documents and conducting interviews, my focus shifted to trying to digest a huge volume of evidence to be able to do this project quickly. And so I didn't go to the city attorney with this issue to try and get some, an order or something to require the police department to give us access to evidence.com. It's certainly something I could have done, but I prioritized other.
But I decided not to fight losing battles.
But in general, it is the city
attorney. I get it.
And her, her subordinate lawyers who provide advice to both my office as well as the DPD.
Can y'all hear the shade?
So to make sure I'm clear, the city attorney, which is a mayoral appointee, is the same lawyer who would be tasked with defending the police departments.
Yep.
They're the same lawyer that would interpret what you have access to under the ordinance. So everybody's got the same counsel, essentially.
Uh-huh.
That's correct.
That's right.
Okay.
You got it.
Thank you.
See what we've been, you see what we have been protesting, y'all?
Okay,
this is why we got to show up to city government and we got to give a shit
mutual aid from
about city council.
To non-resident DPD officers. Roughly how much city funding was bled out to the suburbs over the course of these events, i.e. salary/overtime paid to officers that will not be recouped through Denver property and sales tax, etc., but will rather bolster the economy, schools, infrastructure where officers actually live. I'm not advocating for residency requirements because those do not improve police-community relations, but instead we need to figure a figure for how much of our budget is improving surrounding municipalities while our own suffers.
So my understanding is that the DPD was not required to pay, or Denver was not required to pay officers who provided mutual aid during the protests. I could be wrong about that. I know that at least in terms of the munitions that were expended by those agencies and provided, I've been told that there was no sort of bill due from Denver associated with those expenditures. In terms of overtime, certainly there was overtime paid, or I believe there to have been overtime paid by the department to DPD officers. I don't know what that number is. We didn't really investigate the finances here. That feels like an appropriate subject for the city council. And in fact, I know several council members who've expressed similar concerns and questions about the finances, and they may be interested in looking into that, but that's not something that we'll be looking to.
From an anonymous attendee, it seems pretty clear that in some ways DPD had little organization and no clear strategy as to why they were even present during the protests. To the monitor and COB's knowledge, are there any models or theories of responding to large demonstrations without police that you can speak to?
Yeah.
And what, if anything, does this report mean should change about the broader approach DPD takes towards crowd control events?
Means we don't fucking need them.
Disorganization and negative consequences of their.
I think I feel the beer.
I think that's a really good question. I don't know that it has a clear answer, but I think it's an important question. I would say that there did appear to be a change.
Oh my God!
Some of the tactics that we saw being used by the police department as the protests wore on. Again, we saw kind of more distance. We saw less intervention. We saw reduced number of arrests. We saw fewer uses of less lethal munitions by the department. We saw skirmish lines and officers being stationed kind of farther away from the site of protest activity. I think those are all important tools. We talk about de-escalation in individual uses of force, the need to de-escalate, and distance is one of the sort of primary de-escalators, time and distance, giving things an opportunity to cool down, reducing the opportunities for the use of force. And so I think the same principle applies with the kind of overall approach to crowd.
Ask your wife how well that works. I know that when my husband says, I'm going to wait for you to cool down and walks away, it don't help much.
If that worked well,
I don't de-escalate, but clearly I'm a problem, y'all.
Days of the protests, how could that be
right, baby?
Established, or how could they create some additional?
You hear him laughing in the other room? He's laughing.
Tools and philosophies to make sure that's the approach they take in general for any future, mass protest events.
Did you? What's it called?
I think the question asked about protests that involve
Christmas what?
The Christmas break-in.
Break-in? Like
about a girl breaking in on Christmas. Breaking into
a protest, an approach that involves
probably because she is homeless, right?
It may be out there, but I'm not aware of it.
She's not.
I think having police who are, as far away as possible.
I need to tell the mayor to fuck off a couple little bit more, and then I'm going to come and snuggle you, okay? Can I snuggle you now? I'm going to come snuggle you. It's going to happen.
One of my questions.
What do we do when we hear the Star Spangled Banner?
My peer friend, comrade, Vinny
You tell our teachers to turn it right off.
We've had other protests against police brutality with
the Star
Paul
Spangled Banner.
Castaway,
Exactly.
thinking about Michael Marshall. So what
That's
changed with
When you
this,
hear it,
where it
you
did
say, "Turn that off," or I'm
escalate,
calling mom.
with the degree of police presence
But
being there?
I'm not allowed to call them mom.
You can if someone turns on Star Spangled Banner.
The crowd behavior, they will distinguish those
That is an
events
emergency.
from
Always. Someone's trying to make you do something you don't want to do, and you should never want to do that. You call me.
Violence or
I don't
the
care what
level
you're
of
doing.
anger.
Or if they tell you, you call the police.
The police, that may be a partial answer. That may not be, a good answer.
Go to my bed. I'll be
There
in
may
there.
be a lot of things that.
Or we just call Jeremiah Elliott. He'll sort
distinguish
it all
those
out.
protests from this one. This, of course, unfolded in the middle of the pandemic and kind of, during or after a major lockdown. There were a lot of factors that probably influenced officer behavior as well as crowd behavior. I'm not aware of a specific change inside the police department, a philosophical change between those protests and this one. There's no sort of clear line that we were able to identify that indicated that they had adopted a more aggressive philosophy towards policing protest. But I think there were probably a lot of factors that influenced both crowd and officer behavior.
Great. Kate, you're right. This is totally a masterclass in shade. Oh my God.
Prioritize taking all of these different suggestions, and you can think of the top 3 that your office has probably worked on and given in this report. What would those top 3 be? Because if things move as if they always have, we don't expect a lot of this list to be done in a short amount of time. But if we can walk away, and I'm interested in what you perceive as 3 impactful changes from this list that as a community and as a board that we could be more aware of, and ones that we could take in bite-sized chunks.
Yeah, I appreciate the question.
My mom's going to order ice cream. If you just repeat after me,
over to this board and to the community. I feel like my role was to do.
Fuck you, Mayor Hancock.
I have a certain kind of technical knowledge.
You can say that because I said it's okay, but otherwise you can't say it without unless I give you direct permission until you turn 18. Can you say it? Fuck you, Mayor Hancock.
Here you are, a Hancock.
Close enough. Give me a kiss.
And
I'll order ice cream.
What the priorities are.
Go sit on the bed. Go sit on the bed.
Question for folks to say what they think is most important. Certainly, some of the
They're my
recommendations
kids.
are
Whatever. I can do what I want.
Addressed yesterday. banning rubber ball grenades. The protests are up.
Plus, you think my kids don't come out in black
and
and like demand shit after this summer?
Deployed in Denver. Some of the
Mom,
policy changes and fixes
we're not taking
can and should
baths.
have already been taken care of by the department. The bigger kind of
Someone taught them how to, like, if they
questions,
demand together and threaten to set things on fire, then they'll get what they want.
You know, many of the other recommendations, I think I would kind of
It's a
put it
fun
back
summer.
to the community to get everyone else's thoughts about what's most important right now. Certainly, training needs to increase, and it needs to increase quickly to put the department in a better position if something else unfolds like the George Floyd protests.
Absolutely, thank you.
A question from an anonymous attendee. I've witnessed police officers remark to protesters while they're under arrest, take it up with the independent monitor if you don't like the way I'm treating you. Do you think that the independent monitor has the necessary power to oversee rogue police officers? And
No, they don't. They said as much this morning. It's not their job. It's literally not their job. They refer them back to IAB.
To the corrupt powers at work. If not, what do you need to get these actors in work?
That's interesting. Take it up with the independent. I've actually seen that on body camera footage. Do I think we have the necessary power?
No.
That's a question that
no one does.
Comes up repeatedly.
You don't have any authority.
I think issues have already been raised on this call about other powers that we should have access to information. We should have. There have been questions about legal advice. Things that could be done to ensure kind of true independent operation of the office. I know the council is interested in looking at legislative change to address some of those issues. So I think this is an evolving system. It's an evolving structure. We're always finding out new issues that need to be corrected. And I think we've identified some of them on this call already.
A question from Caleb Munro. It's heartening that, according to news reports, DPD has said that it agrees with the 16 recommendations in the OIM report. But what process exists to track progress and hold them accountable? Does OIM play a role in assessing implementation of these changes down the road?
I think we will have to. I think to make it meaningful, to provide some measure of assurance to the public, I think the OIM will have to do that work. I think there will have to be a follow-up report to the community. The department has said that it's planning to create an online dashboard to keep the public apprised of changes it's making. But I think it'll be incumbent on us to obtain documents and other information and sort of validate whether or not those changes are meaningful and have been appropriately made. So I would say to expect more from the OIM on that issue.
Julia, I actually have a question for our board chair in follow-up to the previous question about the OIM having the power and authority to check potential police abuses. Al, could you speak a little bit about the role
No, you guys
of the
have to sit together
COB
until the ice cream gets here.
as distinct from the role of the OIM in terms of advocating for our oversight system and maybe how the community can get in touch with us if they have
You want cookies and cream?
ways they'd like to see the oversight system.
Can you say Black Lives Matter?
Sure, and thank you,
Okay.
Nikki.
Can you say
I'll
no justice, no
start with
peace?
this.
Repeat after me. No
a
justice,
couple
no
of
peace.
ways
I know how to say
that
it.
the
No
community
justice,
can
no
reach
peace.
us. Let me start with that.
No
So
That's right. Look at you. I'm so
ways
proud of you. That was amazing.
One is on Facebook.
How do you remember that?
Facebook.com
I did take you there once, you're right.
/COB.
Everybody see that's my girl.
And through our newsletter, which you can
So
sign
proud.
up for
Okay, get a milkshake too.
Facebook as well. That's a great way to keep track.
No,
of what we're
okay, we'll
doing
start with ice cream.
in the
I don't want to make
community
your tummy hurt like it did last
what
time.
types of issues that we're focused
I love
on,
you.
as well as
God, I
Twitter
love you.
at Denver_COB. From the COB perspective, our main leverage is the voice of the community. and our ability to bring the community together in a voice that speaks to those that are in office and in charge, such as the sheriff and the chief and the director of safety. And that is our strongest tool that we have in the toolbox of ensuring to the question that we got earlier about ensuring that change is taking place and it is trackable. The OIM, the independent monitor, has access to the information. And then part of our job as a Citizens Oversight Board is to make sure that we're a voice out there to the community and to the powers that be, that the community is concerned and we are watching, and we do have a vested interest in the independent monitor having access to all the information they need. We go back to the evidence.com question. How then do we ensure that the independent monitor has access to all of the information that he needs? That's part of our job from the COB, is to address, to challenge, and to engage those folks in the city that can ally themselves along with us in the community to ensure that we have full access. So really our job is to come alongside the OIM.
Sorry, I've been busy ordering her ice cream.
Standing in proxy for the community.
I love her.
To ensure that we're getting access to
I know,
all
that
the
made me so
information
happy.
that we need, and that change
She
is truly
remembered.
happening in the way that it should be happening. And in another aspect,
Love
those
my
rules that
babies.
are on the books already, those things that we should be doing, when we meet with the director of safety, when we meet with the sheriff, when we meet with the chief of police, is to ask those questions then, why aren't they being done? Or in cases where they are, thank them for continuing to give us the right access, and when things are being done right as well.
Thank you, Al. And I want to highlight a comment in the Q&A from Dee DePerson, who sits on the nominating committee from the COB, who says they are actively recruiting for vacant positions if folks are interested in serving.
Thank you. We'll take a couple more, I'm guessing, from the community. I'm happy we're getting so much participation tonight, which is great. Julia is working her fingers to the bone, trying to toggle back and forth and fill in. So it's been great.
Julia, you're amazing.
April is going to cover a couple of the questions.
Go, April, go!
Yeah, first Alice has, what are punitive measures taken after these serious activities have been discovered?
None.
And if so, who will follow up?
Nobody. Us.
Yeah, so that probably relates to the ongoing internal affairs investigations. The punitive measures could be discipline, up to and including termination. And we will follow up on all of those cases to make sure that they're appropriately investigated and report back to the community on the outcomes.
And kind of similar, I'll blend to the first being, Penny's asking, I guess, you, Nick, and us, what are next steps for DPD regarding this report? And then how are people of Denver expected to respect and trust DPD after understanding the violent, unaccountable ways in which they operate?
My God, I love you so much.
Anyone on the board want to tackle that second question?
Who wants to tackle that question?
I could easily give an answer, but I'm gonna give someone else a chance to answer that.
I think that's a question for the department itself.
That's a great question, and that's why I wish that the chief had been on here tonight, because I knew that there would be a lot of questions to that area. I can only say from the COB's perspective that we are definitely in tune with the type of questions and the sentiment that's coming from the community, because right now, the law enforcement period works at a trust deficit. And part of all of our jobs is to try to cure that deficit. But unfortunately, we can't answer for them tonight.
then another one that might help guide our question a little bit comes from Stan, who attends our regular kind of Friday meetings. First, he says, I certainly appreciate the efforts of Mr. Mitchell and the OIM. Can the COB comment on other organizations like the Transformation Group or Reimagining Group that are concerned with these topics? I know a few of us, when we were arranging this community forum, had
You were
discussed
amazing and
another
glorious, and I
forum
love you.
at the beginning
And
of
I'm not
next
saying
year
that because I've been
to invite some
drinking a
various
gigantic goddamn
stakeholders
beer.
who have been having these
Truly
conversations
glorious.
to that forum. So I know that's one thing that we have planned for our first quarter of next year, but I don't know if there's any other comments from us.
Who would speak after you, babe? No one could.
April, I think it just bears mention that we're always grateful for engaged community members, no matter what committee they assemble themselves into, or volunteer group or not-for-profit. We need everybody at the table. So we look forward to learning more about their work and perspectives.
Yeah, you know, that constant engagement from the community is really where the strength of not just COB, but even as you talk about reimagining police, which we're fully aware of at the COB, and although we're not driving that effort, we're definitely behind that effort and understanding ways that we can improve it. And so I would say that to Nikki's point, the ability to stay engaged and to bring other community members into the conversation so that we can be proactive with things and not wait until there's a George Floyd incident before we start looking at policies and procedures. But if we stay engaged all year and stay engaged as best we can use that accountability arm all throughout the year and not just when crisis takes place. Any other questions? Probably take one more, I'm guessing, from the community before we adjourn.
Maybe there are two quick questions.
Okay, sure.
The first is a couple of questions related to the function and form of the OIM. How many people total work for / dedicated to OIM, and how many employees worked on this report? And then the second question is, can you speak to the nature of injuries police officers sustained during the protest?
So regarding the first question, we are 15 employees total, divided into kind of 3 primary areas. So my team of monitors who are lawyers. We have several policy analysts on our staff, and we have an outreach team that works on outreach events and issues. How many employees work on the report? Probably 7 or 8, serving in different roles. Some folks working on, review of video. Some folks focusing on review of radio communication. Other folks helping me with interviews I was conducting. So it was probably 7 or 8 total, I would estimate. In terms of the injuries to police officers, I think they kind of spanned the range. Some officers were hit by a moving vehicle and I think sustained some pretty serious injuries.
Wait, who did that?
Other officers were hit
And buy you a drink.
Rocks and other projectiles.
Oh, were they hit by rocks?
Sustained,
Oh,
soft tissue damage.
soft tissue damage? No!
In some cases.
Did we hurt their feelings too?
So I think there was
Oh my God, soft tissue damage.
all the way from just bruising all the way to serious injuries, in particular in connection with the vehicle incident.
Mr. Mitchell, on the first question, can you talk about the size of your office relative to the size of the safety departments?
The police department is probably 1,500 sworn officers and many other civilian employees. The sheriff department, which we also oversee, maybe around 900-ish sworn deputies and many other civilian employees. The executive director of the Department of Safety, large team of helping him to oversee the safety agencies. I don't know how big that team is. It's certainly bigger than the OIM. So from, in terms of scale, we're extremely small in terms of the scale of the agencies that we oversee.
In its open letter in response to the death of George Floyd of policing in Denver on June 5th, the second recommendation made by the COB was that Denver consider funding its oversight agencies by pegging oversight budgets to police expenditures. And I think that speaks to the different sizes of the departments and what you've been tasked with.
Yeah, it's a huge point. Well, thank you. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Julia, for filling all those questions, and you, April, as well, for doing that. Thank you to the community. And before we
thank you to April for being glorious.
that
Dr. Alexander.
Fortunate in this city.
As I like to call her,
to
Dr.
have such
Beyonce.
a, capable and smart group of people in the COB. Your citizens.
Not just
Oversight
smart.
Board,
This is volunteer.
really does do a lot of work behind the scenes. Keep in mind, we are all volunteers, and we all do this because we simply are looking for to do things the best way that they can possibly be done, and to make sure that the community is being heard at the table, not just a seat at the table, but a voice at the table, and go beyond being a voice, but actually making change. We're also fortunate to have Nick Mitchell as our independent monitor, who I think has done a good job with this report and created a good roadmap. Now, to his point, the work is for us to do, not just the COB, us being the community. And I can promise you that we will be reaching out to hear your voice as we prepare to try and set up what's priority for us over this next coming year. The schedule, we will figure out when our next quarterly public forum is, especially with COVID and the way that things are kind of changed up now with our timing. So I ask you to bear with us from that perspective. But there again, stay connected with us over Facebook and get busy in our news in our newsletter. And we hope to see you on first and third Fridays.
Where do we sign up for the Citizen Oversight Board newsletter?
Be safe and good night.
Ooh. Wait, sorry, I gotta tweet this. I wanna sign up for that newsletter. So there's that. No accountability. Legally, it's in the city charter. So when I beg you guys to give a shit about local politics, elections, and ballot initiatives, this is why. It's so we can literally change the city charter. And I didn't dream that up. It's from Candy Baca herself. So what we need to do is change the city charter in order to bust the police union, in order to reallocate funds away from the police department and into things that might not kill Black people and transgender individuals and the indigenous and the disabled, people with autism. I don't know, just saying. I don't like murder. It's a thing. But there we go. So I am going to finish my beer and my ice cream and snuggle my kids. Yes, because I heard Dr. Beyonce speak. Now my night's complete. And I need a whole lot of self-care. I think I might be bathing in magnesium later. If you saw the earlier threads on Twitter, there's going to be a lot of self-care for the foreseeable future. I hope you get some as well. Love you guys. And I hate everyone on city council except Candy Baca. Fuck the rest of you. I mean that.